afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Understanding Disproportionality webinar. During today's session, we'll be discussing practitioner implementation practices for addressing disproportionality. I am Heather Ngoma. I'm the State Coordinator for REL MidAtlantic, and I'll be facilitating today's session. Joining me is my co-host from the New Jersey Department of Education, Dr. Laura Marana, who is the Interim Executive County Superintendent for Middlesex and Mercer counties. And we also have with us our distinguished panel of school leaders from New Jersey and New York, who will be introduced in a few moments. And finally, our panel moderator, Dr. Patrick Jean-Pierre, the Director of the NYU Technical Assistance Center on Disproportionality. And before we advance with the agenda, I would like to point out ways to communicate with the webinar team and with each other. In the top right bar, there is a parking lot where you can post questions about the webinar content. And in the bottom right is an area where you can ask for help with technical issues. I would also like to point out the resources that are available for you to download. They are located under my picture to the left, and they right now include the PowerPoint for today's discussion. Now on to the session agenda. So today's session will start with an overview of REL MidAtlantic, followed by a brief discussion of the collaboration between REL MidAtlantic, the New Jersey Department of Education, and the NYU Technical Assistance Center on Disproportionality. We will then hear from our moderator and panelists during the presentation segment. We'll take questions during the Q&A period, and then finally wrap up. So for those of you who did not attend any of our previous webinars, REL MidAtlantic is one of 10 regional educational laboratories throughout the nation. We are funded by the Institute of Education Sciences, which is the research arm of the U.S. Department of Education. Our particular service region includes New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, and the District of Columbia. And for those of you who are participating from states that I did not mention, I want to point out that you do have a REL that serves you in your region. REL MidAtlantic provides no-cost direct research services and technical assistance support to education stakeholders throughout our service region. All of our services emphasize research and data use. Direct research services include descriptive studies, policy scans, literature reviews, research syntheses, and rigorous studies. Our data-focused technical assistance products and services range from trainings, workshops, and webinars to white papers and how-to guides. So now that you know a little bit about REL MidAtlantic, I'd like to turn things over to Laura Marana, who will move us along to the goals of this webinar series, and then introduce our moderator and our distinguished panelists. Laura?
Heather, thank you so much, and thank you to everyone who is participating in today's webinar. It's been so exciting, particularly looking at the work that we have done collectively in terms of beginning a journey in terms of understanding equity and disproportionality. And I am positive that upon self-reflection, all of us recognize how much deeper and how much more extensive our knowledge base has become through the participation in the webinar series. I could not be more grateful for the opportunity to work with you, Heather, but also REL in general, but also the Technical Assistance Center on Disproportionality at NYU. You have provided our districts, our educators, with amazing, amazing resources to equip them to be obviously ready to lead the exploration and work around educational equity and disproportionality, not only at the student level, classroom level, obviously also school and district levels. We are definitely very, very appreciative of the opportunity. So we want to be able to maximize the time today. We've spoken a great deal about equity and disproportionality, not only in terms of I'm just going to skip that one, in terms of understanding the definition, and I think there was a great deal of talked about that, but also looking at the complexity associated with disproportionality and understanding and taking action to address whatever issues were identified. So I'm using this slide as a reminder of the work that you've done and you will continue to do at the district level. So once again, a journey that began a number of months ago, and also looking at the disproportionality, which has more than one cause. And that was a wonderful conversation that the presenters in a way led and also promoted reflection on the work that all of us do in our districts, in our schools and classrooms and why not. So wanted to just simply quickly highlight the work that was done, and obviously looking at today's presentation, which is going to be a wonderful opportunity for all of us to hear from those who are out there in the field. And to accomplish that, we have quite a panel, I am going to say, not only in terms of the extensive experience that they have, but also the sort of varied sort of composition or the demographic sort of status of the various districts. Therefore, you will hear a great deal from our educators and our panelists. So I will begin literally with some highlights about each and every one of our panelists. Their bio is quite extensive, and yet I wanted to give you some highlights in terms of the work that they have done and also the mission that they have in each and every one of their districts. So, for example, I will begin with Clarence Ellis, who currently serves as a superintendent for District 17 in Brooklyn. He is a longtime educator and administrator who leads 35 schools in central Brooklyn. Clarence believes that creating a learning environment defined by high expectations and high-quality teaching. As a leader, he believes in plays an active role within the community and values the input from families as key players in the education of his students. So thank you so much for serving as a panelist today, and you'll hear from him in just a little while. Larry Spring, also serving as the superintendent in such a role in the Schenectady City School District. Larry is an advocate for the disadvantaged and those living in poverty. He applies extensive experience using systems and data to uncover inequities, and he is leading this City School District through systemic change so that race, economics, and disability will not be predictors of student achievement. So we have quite a range of experience and knowledge right with the panelists. Teresa Rafferty, serving as the superintendent of schools in Piscataway, New Jersey. She has been extensively involved in operations, program development, strategic planning, business enterprises, and emergency planning. Teresa has served at the New Jersey School Boards Association and is a former president and member of her local Board of Education. A nice also perspective from the Board of Education members. And we have Dr. Alex Gray, who serves as the principal of Martin Luther King Junior Intermediate School in Piscataway. He was raised and educated in the Piscataway community, and he has worked in the school system his entire career. Alex focuses on maintaining high standards of achievement for each of his students. He encourages his students, faculty, and families to embrace their community's diversity and to live the dream of the school's namesake. And moving right along, I'm almost done, and we'll get on to the presentation. Dr. Victor Valeski, currently serving as the superintendent in East Brunswick. Positions as assistant superintendent, director of support services, and director of finance. He founded Design for Learning, a firm specializing in the analysis and optimization of classroom and facility workspaces. Victor is also an adjunct professor at Wilmington University in Delaware. And Joyce Foley, currently serving as the principal of the Monroe Elementary School, an extraordinary school with a long-standing tradition of excellence. Joyce has established a true community of learners who are committed to providing each student in grades K through 5 with a challenging and nurturing educational experience. So as you can see, that quick and sort of introduction gives you a sense, an insight into their experience and the work that they're leading within each and every one of their districts. So to begin the conversation, I am delighted to introduce to you Dr. Patrick Jean-Pierre, who is not unfamiliar to many of you. And with that, I would like to turn it over to you, Patrick.
Yes, welcome everyone. Thank you for being a part of this great collaboration and wonderful event. Just to tell you a little bit about the Technical Assistance Center on Disproportionality. We work with districts throughout the New York State area on addressing issues related to equity. We support districts in shifting their beliefs, policies, and practices to address disproportionality, and the work is done with a culturally responsive approach. In addition to that, we have received a 5-year grant from the New York State Department of Education, who has taken the lead in addressing disproportionality throughout New York State with multiple districts. We work in two ways with districts. We either can work with you directly and embedded in your district to support you in a variety of issues related to disproportionality. And we also support hundreds of districts throughout New York State, from New York City to the Capital Region to the Buffalo region. We often work with districts for a 2-year minimum, but we do provide you with additional support as needed. So with no further delay, I will go right to asking our wonderful panelists some questions. So to begin, panelists, we all know that both research and practice shows that how disproportionality occurs varies from one school district context to the next. So therefore, can you each tell us about you, your district, as well as what experiences within your district that has led to a commitment to addressing disproportionality?
Yes. Hello. This is Clarence Ellis from Community School District 17 in Brooklyn, New York City Department of Education. How this work became familiar to me was 2 years ago. I was a deputy cluster leader. I helped run 300 schools, and that was when City was identified by the State Department of Ed as a school that was involved in disproportionate practices. So although there are 32 community school districts in our system, according to the state, we're considered one big district. So prior to my role as superintendent, I was investigating and doing some research, and I saw that there was this wholesale suspension and teacher removal practices. From the slightest incident, I didn't see much guidance intervention. There was much data on suspension, but very little guidance intervention to prevent reoccurrence. So much so that when I became the superintendent, I felt that we should bring the support for disproportionality to our district. The advantage that we had bringing it to a community school district was, in years past, to cover the root cause sessions, we would have to do one root cause session a month. So that would take 4 months for the root cause sessions, and then we couldn't get down to the work for 5 months. Bringing it to our district directly, we were able to do our root cause sessions within 2 weeks. By the third week, we were practicing alternative strategies as opposed to suspension. We felt the immediate pushback from our principals was that since most of our children were African American and Latino, they said, if all our children are Black and Latino, how will we be engaging in disproportionate practices? Then we looked at many districts around the country with a similar demographic, and we felt that we were being a bit extreme with our suspensions. Many other districts have alternatives to suspensions, and it prevents reoccurrence. And children learn as a result of discipline instead of punishing. So some of the data that we looked at from September of 2014 to April of 2015, we had 1,785 high-level incidents. So this year, for the same time span, September 2015 to April of 2016, we had a similar amount of incidents, 1,732 incidents. So our incidents were only reduced by 3%. But what was astounding was that the suspensions were reduced dramatically. Our suspensions were reduced by 49%. We went from 825 teacher removal, principal suspension, and superintendent caliber suspensions to 411. And I attribute that directly to a change in teacher expectations and a change from the fixed mindset to the growth mindset that the strategies of the TACD initiative help to inform our practice.
Thank you. Yes, are there any other panelists who would like to respond to this question?
Yeah. Hi, this is Victor Valeski from East Brunswick.
Great. Go ahead, Victor.
I was just saying that here in East Brunswick, we're a school district of about 8,300 students. We're essentially located in New Jersey, about equal distance between Philadelphia and New York City. We have, in the last couple of years, seen a change in the demographic of our population. We see a lot of students moving into our district mid-educational career. Families making choices to relocate to East Brunswick for educational opportunities. And so we see students arriving in our district with experiences in other districts, other urban settings, and typically around third grade, we're starting to see that influx of students. And so one of the things that we started to notice was the socioeconomic status of the families that were coming in our district was distinctly different than the families that had been here historically. So we were a district known for high performance, but also a high level of family support. So we have families now where parents are coming. They still desire that great public school education, but the families are working multiple jobs. In some cases, both parents are actively working. And so the actual connection between family and student is becoming looser, and we're seeing more resources by the school district to bring up basic skills. And so our issue really about disproportionality was based on socioeconomic factors, and we started to uncover that discipline and other factors of proportionality were related to issues of economic income.
Here in Piscataway, this is Teresa Rafferty. Here in Piscataway, our experience was a little bit different that led us to this conversation. We are historically a very diverse district, about 35% Asian, about 30% African American, and 18% equally Hispanic and white. And for a couple of years, we were noticing that our partially proficient students at grades 3 and 4 were overwhelmingly African American. We simultaneously were looking at our high school honors and AP courses, noticing that there's overrepresentation in certain groups in enrollment. And we saw that disproportionality, even though we didn't really use the terminology yet. But what was our remedy? So we started putting programs in place, the tutoring programs, after-school support programs. We implemented response to intervention. And then as we started doing some research, realized we were throwing technical solutions at problems that were really adaptive. And we hadn't really looked at the causes of disproportionality or our district beliefs about what, quote, good student looks like, or what are the practices that helped our students to gain entry into the more rigorous coursework. And we looked at suspension rates the same way and realized that they were very disproportionate. So a couple of years ago, we started having this conversation with the principals on the topic of culturally sensitive instruction, and we just introduced some of the readings of some of the writings of Pedro Noguera and some of the others on issues of leadership as it relates to this topic. But I have to also say that within the past couple of years, more than half of our principals had retired, and that provided the district with leadership opportunities that were ready and willing to address this issue. So when we were offered the opportunity to participate with Patrick and get training, like 7 out of our 10 principals just jumped right on board and said they wanted to participate in the training and to address some of the issues, mostly in our community as in terms of academics and discipline.
Good afternoon. This is Larry Spring from Schenectady City School District, and I identified the issues of disproportionality as I came into the district. I'm in my 4th year as superintendent in Schenectady. Found that there was significant disproportionality along the lines of race, economics, and disability, whether we were looking at disciplines, superintendent hearings and long-term suspensions, course enrollment for advanced or challenging coursework, passing rates, dropout, and graduation rates. Kind of across the board, race, economics, and disability showed themselves as being powerful predictors for student achievement. And so that came out loud and clear in my entry plan, and it was something that I presented to the Board of Education shortly after I arrived as the core issue that we needed to address, how it is that the system responds to our children. Schenectady is a small city district, about 10,000 students. About a third of our students are black, a third are white, 20% Latino, and about 30-some languages spoken in the district. So we're a diverse district. We've got kids from all over the world with lots of different languages, lots of different backgrounds, but being treated by the system in very, very different ways, and having very different kinds of experiences in the community. And so we're approaching this work not just as work that the school is doing, but we're working hard in our partnerships with law enforcement, with probation, with social service agencies, to try to help the entire city change the way in which we're responding to kids and address disproportionality, whether we're talking about it within schools or if we're talking about disproportionate minority contact with law enforcement or the foster care system or any of these other agencies. This is a comprehensive initiative.
Thank you, panelists, for those thorough responses and really for providing us with your personal district stories and giving us some unique insight into how you begin to address this complex issue. So one of the things I want us to continue to elaborate on is that, both research and practice has proven that beliefs, policies, and practices can either be the causes or the solutions for addressing disproportionality. Can each one of you highlight some efforts that your district has made to institute specific beliefs, policies, and practices, such as either data collection that has actually prevented and reduced disproportionality in your district?
Yes. This is Clarence from District 17. Well, when we first started instituting our root cause sessions, we had some really down-to-earth conversations and honest conversations with our deans, our guidance counselors, and some of our administrators. And we found that many of them were painting our children and their families with a very broad brush. If they had maybe one negative encounter with a family member or a student, they would make the statement, okay, all these kids, all their families, and that was the initial response I received. But we did some surveying and some conversations, and the beliefs that we first encountered when I arrived at the district, a district of 15,000 students, is that the students who engage in poor behaviors frequently and the ones who are unresponsive to current academic settings appear to be black males, and the staff believe that these students should be punished. Now, of course, they didn't say that directly, but when I looked at the data and I looked at the outcomes, that's what was happening. The policies of these same schools were that they were punitive, and the schools only had really two solutions, either an in-school suspension or an out-of-school suspension as a method of responding to poor behavior. Ultimately, the practices in the district were all over the place. Although the New York City Department of Ed has one citywide code for discipline, we found that the implementation of the disciplinary practices were not judicious, and they were very heavy-handed. We felt that some minor infractions were students that participate in minor behavioral issues were receiving very, very severe punishments. So as such, we decided to work on developing district-wide and school-based guardian of equity teams. We felt that this is our job to protect. So our teams are called guardian of equity teams, and we came up with 5-year plans to make this change. This situation did not occur overnight, so there's no way I could expect these principals and their staff to make a change overnight. So we come up with a 5-year plan to implement the change. And this was based on feedback from the staff, research that we've culled from NYU and the supports. As such, our reduction in incidents and suspensions is significant, but moreover, we feel that the tone and climate of our buildings are healthier, and we feel that there's a greater degree of higher teacher expectations, and that's evident by teachers coming to the classroom much more well prepared. There was a lot of pushback in terms of the unions and lesson planning, so we felt that higher expectations, the initial proof of that is that teachers come to the job well prepared. They feel that all children can learn, and we're seeing, we saw some academic gains last year that were impressive. In fact, our district had the second highest gain proportionately in the city in literacy and math, and I attest much of that to a change in our mindset and from that of fixed to growth.
Hi, this is Joyce Foley, and I'm an elementary principal in East Brunswick. So last summer, with my leadership team, we analyzed many pieces of school data, including our assessment data, special education and 504 referrals, INRS data, and our discipline data. And what we discovered were discrepancies among many of the subgroups. In our work, in an effort to ensure equity for all of our students, we've really begun the conversation around disproportionality this school year, having many conversations at staff meetings, really trying to drill down and uncover teacher biases. Some of the work we plan going forward is to establish a common language among all staff members and really look at some professional development opportunities where we can train teachers on being more culturally responsive and, as you said, fostering a growth mindset for all of our students.
Yeah. Our experience in Piscataway, this is Teresa Rafferty, has been similar to Joyce's. We started the conversation with the full leadership team last August, and various principals have addressed it in different ways with their staff. Some are obviously more comfortable with it than others. But when we looked at suspension data, we, obviously when it's a fight or substance abuse, there was pretty much consistency across the board. But when you looked at those subjective categories, we had very disproportionate rates of suspension. One of the things that's helped is as counselors have retired, in our elementary schools, we have behaviorists almost across the board. The behaviorists have been very helpful in providing consultation to classroom teachers. They help to identify triggers for behavior and provide interventions so that we don't get to that process where a child needs to be removed from the classroom. And at one of the schools, the presence of the behaviorist over a couple of years, they reduced suspensions 66% just by those interventions. That has led to us to revise the code of conduct across the district. and emphasize the behavioral interventions, which were always in place but may not have always been followed as consistently across the district. But the behavioral interventions are really emphasized first. Now, that's going to take place this summer. We're going to be doing PD with principals and then with our teachers again in the fall. And that's going to be a real cultural shift for people because, as Clarence said, he's been doing this longer than we have. As Clarence said, there were people that were resistant at first. There are some people that just think this behavior requires that punishment, and we really want to help kids to follow a positive path and not to be removed from school. One of the things our high school did in addressing this is that teachers no longer, quote, send kids to the office for certain behaviors. The teacher now simply describes what occurred in the classroom, and an administrator assigns the label to the behavior and issues the consequence. And that's been very enlightening in terms of, obviously there's a lot of subjectivity when you're identifying disrespect or insubordination.
Just to follow up, this is Alex Gray, also from Piscataway. Just to follow up on Ms. Rafferty's comments about Piscataway. As a principal in Piscataway, the training was very beneficial to us, and we took a lot from it. We immediately began to look at some of our policies as administrators to determine what types of inequities might be occurring on a district level and within our individual buildings. One thing we noticed on the 4 or 5 level were some inequities in access to G&T programs, which also translated onto our middle school level, where there were inequities in the backgrounds of students who made it into our accelerated programs. It caused us to come together and form a committee to be able to assess, what we could do to make those accelerated and academic opportunities more reflective of our overall district population. One thing that we noticed that the groups that were underrepresented, particularly African Americans and Hispanics, were very underrepresented, despite having a significant portion in our district. There were very low numbers and low percentages in those academically gifted and accelerated programs. One thing that we put into place this year, myself and the other 4 or 5 principal, we put together an action plan to really address that issue on our level, with hopes of also making a difference on the middle school level. We realized after looking at those students who did not make it into G&T and accelerated, there were a number of students, Black and Hispanic students, who just missed the cutoff. So let's say that the cutoff was for grades was 90% and above. Many of them fell into that 85 to 90 range. And so it wasn't that those students were far from meeting the criteria, but they were very close. And so we determined that let's look at that population of students who just missed G&T, who just missed accelerated. And so we're putting together an action plan to target those students, to give them some extra support, to get the parents on board, to let them know at the start of the school year what they need to do, what the qualifications are to make it into G&T, to make it into accelerated. And so we're going to work with that population and put together an action plan to monitor their progress, to infuse some strategies to help increase the number of underrepresented students that will make it into G&T and make it into accelerated programs on the middle school level.
This is Larry Spring again from Schenectady, and we have 3 kind of major activities, or a lot of things that we've done. But one of the first things that we did is we started with a race equity report card, and we came up with a way to gauge, to give ourselves a grade in how well we're doing with equity through the lens of race. And we presented that report card, the results of that, publicly at a board meeting. It was televised. we had to do a little pre-work before we presented it. We had to present it, to some groups to help them understand the purpose behind it, help them respond in a way that was not defensive, help them understand that this was not attacking, but sharing information, and that our desire was to be helpful, not to run anybody down with it. But we got a D in race equity, and we felt that we had to confront those brutal facts and make sure that we understood that there very clearly was disproportionality happening in our system, and that we played a role in it. One of the things that we did then as follow-up is we instituted a practice in all of our buildings where at the end of every quarter they're doing some behavior analysis, and we have a workbook that they go through that takes a look at all of their behavior incidents for that quarter, analyzes them, identifies places where there might be disproportionality, looks for causes, and has them as a team then think about ways in which they can both minimize the likelihood of those incidents happening, as well as minimize the likelihood that disproportionality is occurring, either in the occurrence of those events or in the delivery of consequences around them. And then the third thing is that we're taking significant steps in finding alternative ways to deal with kids other than suspension. And so finding that most of our students who are ending up in long-term suspension are very racially disproportionate population. There's also a very high percentage of those kids with behavioral health issues, and we find that long-term suspension, or as is often the case with long-term suspension, involvement in the juvenile justice system, that those are both very poor prescriptions for behavioral health issues. And so we're engaged in a kind of a diagnostic and prescriptive process where we're screening students who engage in serious behavior, identifying what their needs are, and matching them with a therapeutic service and getting them back sooner. As soon as they are done with that therapeutic service, we're re-entering them into the school much sooner now, and reducing the length of time that kids are suspended.
Thank you, panelists, for those comments. It seems like you all are tailoring and adapting the work that you're doing for your populations, and it's having a great effect. And I heard some pieces around mindsets and biases. So what I want to know from all of you, and the research shows that, and in our practice, that biases plays a role in disproportionate outcomes. So can you all tell us, how have you seen this potentially played out in your districts, and what exactly are you doing to address it through professional development?
Hi, it's Clarence again, District 17 in Brooklyn. Well, one of the things we noticed was that we felt that since much of our staff were people of color, they felt that culturally relevant education and supportive strategies usually just meant when you're talking about white teachers and children of color. And these are the candid conversations that we really felt that we needed to have. If you have teachers of color who were raised middle and upper class and well off, and they're teaching children of color that are suffering from poverty, you might as well have people from two different planets trying to communicate. And that was the first realization, that culturally relevant education is not some pre-described notion. So that was the first major issue that we encountered. So as a result, we were able to have monthly calls and quarterly meetings. In fact, our principals felt that it was so valuable that they asked to increase the amount of our meetings from 4 to 8 in a year. We also had to recognize that schools, we had to appreciate where they are. We had to meet them where they were. Not every school was on the same level in regard to their approach with this work. So although all of our schools were exposed to the training, we felt that some needed additional support, and some should have been highlighted as showcase schools for different reasons. So one of our schools, for instance, although they have a great environment, great academics, we felt that the black males in their schools were still overly identified for behavioral discipline. And another one of our schools, it was about climate and culture. That's what we needed to work on. In one of our schools, one of our more veteran principals, a kindergarten through 8th grade school, which is a trilingual school, the languages taught are English, Spanish, and Haitian Creole. They are so high-powered in terms of their support for culturally relevant education that all we're working on now is this, fine-tuning instructional practices. And in another one of our schools, the work is on positive behavioral support teams. So the whole idea is understanding that it's not one size fits all. And based on the principal's experience, that of their staff, and their whole approach to dealing with diversity, we have to meet their needs where they are, and that's where the real work lies.
Hi, this is Victor Valeski from East Brunswick, and so we are really a culturally diverse school district. So among our population, we have currently 69 spoken languages. And so in many cases, we have students who are first English speakers in their family. They are the communicators for their family. But I think the bias in our district, and this is really to kind of dovetail on Larry's comments, the biases among our district staff was that we believed historically that everyone who came to East Brunswick was deeply invested in doing their best and doing whatever they needed to do to participate in a high-quality education. We're fortunate. We have 11 buildings, and all 11 of our buildings are Blue Ribbon Schools of Excellence. Now, that's a label, and so we have to constantly re-examine our position. Are we doing today what we were doing when we were awarded that status? And so I think that's where we have to start looking at how do we look at our students, how do we look at ourselves, how do we treat our students? And even though we might believe that we're treating everyone in an equitable fashion, the data really points to a difference. And so that conversation becomes very important about what you believe and what's really occurring. And I think that's really caused us to step back and to begin to examine our position as a district and how we accept those students into our district that are coming from situations. As Larry said, we're seeing long-term discipline, long-term suspension issues coming before our Board of Education. And we have to educate these students. Putting them out long-term suspensions with home-based instruction is not the solution. They need to be invested and involved in their education, and they need to know that they can be successful. And encouraging them to stick with it and to have them sample some of that success is where we need to be, and that's the path we're on right now.
I agree with Victor and Clarence in Piscataway. Every building is in a different place. Some of our principals, they're all on board, but some of them needed to introduce the topic with videos or case studies. Others were very comfortable saying, look, here's the data. What conclusions can you draw from this? As part of our staff development, we've done the teacher survey, and most of us really are unaware of our biases, and that's true of all of us in the district. As we looked at, Alex referenced earlier, the G&T programs, when we've looked at, perceptions. Is band a reward, or is band a student's class that they go to? Getting to why some students behave certain ways and trying to understand the background and adapt to their differences is a real challenge in the district. Rather than, in education, we've often said, well, we treat everybody the same. And we think that's being fair when the reality is that there's another way of doing things.
In one of the trainings that Dr. Jean-Pierre led, with many of the districts in New Jersey, one of the comments I made was that I believe that all the educators in my district, in my school, came into education for the right reason and do not intentionally create situations where disproportionality becomes apparent. But there are inherent biases that we all have and all possess, and we have to work to make sure that those biases don't rise to the surface in our practice as educators. One thing that became apparent to me when I was going through my G&T recommendations this year, we have a criteria that we have established for students to qualify and to meet to be able to be accepted into the G&T program. And so halfway through the year, we had an opportunity where I was able to increase the number of students to go into that program. And typically when those recommendations are made, I don't go through the entire 500 and so student population to check behind my teachers to see if those recommendations are valid or if there are students that they missed. But with this opportunity where I was able to, this year, add students to the program, I asked a group of teachers in one of my grade levels to give me names of additional students to recommend. So we went halfway through the school year, through 2 marking periods, through a number of district assessments. And so I said, we have room to add students to our G&T program. Just give me some names of students who you feel deserve and have earned this opportunity based on the first 2 marking periods. The list I received was a list of students that were all Asian or Indian. And again, I have a very diverse population. And so I didn't question them, but I did begin to do my own research, and I went through the data myself for that entire grade level, and I went by demographic group. And after doing that background check of the students that could potentially qualify to be added to G&T, there were a number of students, probably about 95% African American, that had the same qualifications as all the students that were recommended, yet those names were not given to me. And so I added those names to the program, and by doing so, by doing my own research by demographic group, I doubled the number of African American students who were in my G&T program in this particular grade level. But unfortunately, those names were not given to me by their teachers. So they met the qualifications. In some cases, they exceeded some of the qualifications from the students that were given to me for G&T, but yet those names were not given to me. And so that was very apparent that for whatever reason, whether it was bias, whether it was they just felt like there were some behavior issues, that there was a large number of African American students who earned the right to make it into G&T, but yet were not recommended. And so that really caused me to really dig deeper to try to find some solutions to allow us to have a method of providing students with opportunities that is objective and can be done in a way where we don't allow these biases to rise to the surface. And so I have not had a conversation yet with my staff about that. I'm a very new principal in that building, and one of my goals in addressing disproportionality has been to not appear to be just looking out for students of color, to be a principal for all students, which I am. And so I'm been consulting with the superintendent about the best way to approach that, and in a way that's sensitive, but in a way that gets through to my staff that we have to be educators with integrity, and we have to really make sure that we're operating in a way where no student is prevented from having an opportunity that they have earned and that they deserve.
So Larry Spring from Schenectady again, and I've really made this work central to everything that we do. So looking at it through all of our lenses, we took symbolic action, we took political action, structural action. We made sure that equity was central in everything that we were doing. That meant that there were some very difficult and uncomfortable conversations with folks. So it wasn't enough just for us to look at the data. we certainly looked at the data and people came to some realizations, but there were also conversations that principals needed to have with me about what their disproportionality rate looked like by race around suspensions. I mean, it was really disproportionate with some folks, and those were uncomfortable conversations. And then I showed them the data from some of their teachers and identified, where they needed to go and have some of those same conversations with teachers about discipline. And those conversations did not always go well. They take practice, but it's like all things. You don't get better at it unless you practice. And I think there was a fear with folks that they didn't want to attempt those conversations until they were sure that they could have them and have them well. And we said we really can't wait for that. We need to start addressing this and start addressing it now. We did a lot of professional development. We continue to do a lot of professional development, both through the Technical Assistance Center with Patrick and Maria and those folks. We started with leadership and getting leadership to look at their own practices, their own beliefs, their own procedures and policies, and ways in which we're not being very responsive to kids, and that also involves an awful lot of data. But we used a lot of articles and books as well, and so a lot of buildings latched on to Rich Milner's book, Start Where You Are But Don't Stay There, and they did that as a book talk. As they got more comfortable with the conversation, they found this to be a really accessible resource and a great way to have kind of what you call third-point communication. Getting the issue away from a place where it can be personalized, and we can talk about these vignettes and take a look at that. But I think most importantly is that we've made sure that the equity initiative stays central to the conversation. This is not this year's initiative. It's not for 2 years. This is central to the work that we do. It will always be central to the work that we do, and it needs to be at the top of the agenda. Anytime I'm speaking, it's how I lead the conversation off. It's a part of how we evaluate whether or not we've got a good budget. How does it look through the equity lens? We've got the Board of Education now where they're asking those questions unprompted every time somebody's making a proposal to the board. They ask those questions. It's the primary value now by which we judge our decisions, and that helps to keep it on center stage, and that's, I think, where we get the most leverage.
This is Victor Valeski from East Brunswick, and Larry, I agree with you. When I became superintendent here, one of the things I did is I empowered the staff to really look at everything we were doing. And so we created the EQB equation, which was really like to emphasize East Brunswick. And it's on our website. It's prominent in all of our schools. Our administrators display it. So it really sets the mindset for how we not just look at disproportionality, but everything we do in our school district going forward. Everything is up for debate. Everything is up for reexamination. And so EQB stands for examining our current condition, exploring opportunities to improve academics, the arts, athletics, or any element impacting the culture of our schools and offices, engaging all the appropriate stakeholders in a consensus decision for improvement, and then finally benchmarking the results with data. And so it takes that emotional piece out of it. It's actually looking at data to say, are we really doing what we believe we're doing? Does the data support it or refute it?
Great. Thank you, panelists. It really seems I'm very impressed with how you all make such a complex issue around disproportionality look very easy to address. And it seems particularly what was important in all the things you all shared was that equity was central. As Larry highlighted, equity was central in all the work that you all were doing in addressing the issue. So I want you to provide districts that are listening some context for some of the major challenges you faced in addressing this issue, both on a district and school level. just to give the district a context of what they may have to encounter.
Hi, this is Clarence from Brooklyn, District 17. I feel that one of the things we initially encountered was the whole idea of repetitive programs, additional programs. This is just something else to do. And we know that if you look at, in our state, we have the annual performance review, the APPR. We have Common Core standards. We have, standardized testing, periodic testing. We have response to intervention, our RTI program. We wanted our staff and our schools and the parents and the students to know that this is just not something else to add to the plate. It is the very plate by which we can function. So it's not a program. This is a way of doing business, a way of saying that there's nothing more unequal than the equal treatment of unequals. In other words, all of us have our unique gifts, but we all come with different strengths. We come prepared in different ways. So I also equated to, like, when I met with my staff, I said, look, it's like if I say to all of you, I'm going to give you all $1 million. And everybody started clapping, right? But I said, yeah, that's fine. But if you're already a millionaire, that doesn't matter much. And if you're $5 million in debt already, that's not going to help you much. Sometimes you've got to give different children, different schools, different staff more in order to become level and strong enough to provide the support and services that our students need. So ultimately, I bring it back to expectations. High expectations are a must. If everyone's default mechanism is that the children of color are the underclass, if that's their default mechanism, then we are in for a very, very difficult road. However, when we look at every child as someone that can have this bright light that can lead us, and their potential is limitless. I mean, it's idealistic, but I'm telling you, that's the reason that I got into education 30 years ago, and I'm sure it's the reason that most of my principals did. And we've got to relight that fire and that belief in what's just and what's right.
Hi, this is Joyce Foley in East Brunswick. I would say that one of the challenges I faced this year, starting this conversation around disproportionality with my staff, is really leading the staff to struggle with their own personal beliefs and biases. And in that conversation, we have had a book study around the Growth Mindset book based on the work of Carol Dweck out of Stanford. One of the practical things that we've taken away from that work is we've implemented her Brainology program, which is an online blended learning product that's available for students, and we are beginning to implement this program with the students in our schools.
This is Alex Gray, Piscataway, New Jersey. One thing that has been a challenge for me personally has been how to embark upon this conversation as an African American principal. Myself and my grade 4 or 5 colleague, we have 2 4 or 5 buildings in our district. Both of us are African American principals, and we have a large, most of our teaching staff are white. And so it's a unique situation where we're addressing an issue where the students of color, largely African American, are not receiving the same types of opportunities, are overrepresented in discipline and referrals and things of that nature. But yet we as African Americans have to find a sensitive way to address that with the population that a staff that does not look like me as a principal. And so, and particularly being a new principal, I was trying to establish a culture for my building. And the one thing that I did not want to happen was to be looked upon as a principal that was there to serve the African American population and African American families. And so that was a major challenge for me, embarking on this disproportionality study and this realization was because as a new principal, I'm still in the process in year 2 of setting the tone of the type of leader I want to be and the type of culture I want for my building. And so having that conversation for me with a mainly white staff has been very challenging, and I have not delved into it in the way that I plan to moving forward into next school year after I'm a little more established. In Piscataway, we had other principals that engaged in the disproportionality training, some of whom have been white principals. They have already, from day one, after the trainings, begun to have those conversations with their staff on issues of white privilege and other types of topics. And so in Piscataway, the challenges have been different. The challenges for the white principals have been, how do we address an issue that is impacting largely Black and Hispanic students and families? How do we, as white principals, approach that? And then the Black principals in the district, many of us have said, how do we approach it when the things that we're trying to convey to our staff are things that we need to do to help our disenfranchised students, many of whom are African American and Hispanic, without looking at it in a way that we're just serving and just caring about those populations. And so the approach that we have begun to take, I know at least on the 4 or 5 level in our district, are to create initiatives that will not only benefit the Black and Hispanic students, but will benefit any students in those situations where they're not afforded opportunities. So our goal is to definitely increase, in terms of academically, the numbers of those students who are afforded opportunities, but not making it exclusive where we're just targeting those populations, the Black and Hispanic population. So it is a challenge, but it's something that we're not letting inhibit the great work that we do and the need to address this issue of disproportionality.
This is Larry Spring at Schenectady again, and I think the biggest challenge that we encountered had to do with issues around discipline. And as we started to say that we had significant issues with discipline and we needed to work on rectifying those, a lot of people took the reaction of you're asking us to tolerate behavior that's unacceptable. You're telling us we're not allowed to suspend Black kids anymore, and these kinds of things. And it took a lot of work, and it's work that we're not done with yet, to help people understand that's not what we're saying. We're not saying it's okay to engage in that behavior. What we're saying is that there are reasons why that behavior is happening that we're not addressing. We have to recognize the context that kids come from. We have to recognize the climate and the culture that we create as adults in this building, and we create it in our own image, and we look very different than many of our students. And so how do we be sensitive to the experiences that our kids are coming to us with, what it is that they may have experienced on their way to school that day or last night? How do we be responsive to all of that and recognize it and give them a safe place in which to enter school, a place where they feel okay? And that's been a very hard thing for people to reconcile. It was very difficult. One of the hardest conversations that I've had with folks is helping them to understand how our Black staff feel in our schools. And they're angry about the way in which they experience the system sometimes. And so then helping people to understand that kids who don't have even that much agency are going to be more angry than staff are. And if staff are that angry, given the amount of power that they do have, our kids are walking in the door feeling even angrier. And we need to really purposefully address the climate that we're creating, the culture that we're creating, how it is that we're welcoming and embracing our kids right when they walk in the door. The wrong time to think about disproportionality is in the aftermath of a disciplinary event. Then you're just cleaning up. We need to be doing that work much earlier on, and that's been very difficult for people to get their heads around.
Thank you, panelists. I have one last question. I also want to thank you all for just being guardians of equity. My last question, in one sentence, before we move on to questions from the audience. In one sentence, what advice would you give to other districts who want to start tackling disproportionality tomorrow?
This is Clarence. I would say don't wait. Have your data in hand. Really cull through it, disaggregate it, and as educators, we all have a need for the proof. The proof is in the numbers. So I would say, don't hesitate, and be sure of what you're doing, and present this work with conviction. And to say that ultimately, if we take care of our most needy students, all children, all people will benefit.
Hi, Victor Valeski from East Brunswick. I agree with Clarence. Start early, but also take the blinders off. Look at objectively at your organization, and the beliefs that you may have held in the past. Just kind of unwrap everything and allow people to have a voice, because people will tell you what's really happening, and then you can use the data to either support that belief or to adjust. And so I think it's really important just to be able to listen objectively.
And this is Joyce Foley, also in East Brunswick. I would also add that I think it's important, when possible, to speak to the students to get their perspective on their experiences regarding their education. That's my plan, my next steps for next year.
I would echo those sentiments. I think getting started is probably the most important thing, but I always use this notion of it's never a good idea to solve problems for people. We need to solve problems with people, and so engaging the students, engaging the parents, engaging the community, making sure that you understand exactly what the problem is and what it is that people would hope that you would help them do or do for them. Is really important, and not bypassing that and trying to do for them, which is something I know I sometimes rush to do, and we do in this industry.
This is Alex Gray from Piscataway. Definitely, everything that everyone has said is definitely important. It's important to know where you stand on a district level, what things you have to work on as a district. Also, know what each school needs to work on. One thing that we realized in Piscataway in doing this work is that the needs tended to vary from building to building in terms of where the disproportionality lied and what issues needed to be addressed. So you just have to take a moment to challenge each principal to dig into that data. And so when you talk to your staff, you're not speaking on something that you think is taking place or things that are assumptions, but you can speak to someone said with conviction about what the issues are in that particular building and with that particular population. And I also would say just don't make assumptions. We often make assumptions about things. Don't make assumptions, and avoid assigning blame. We're not here to have these conversations to blame people or to blame teachers or blame our staff, but to move ahead and say, okay, this is the issue that we need to address. Let's address it. Let's move forward. Let's move to a place of equity with our population.
So is that all the panelists?
Yep.
Data, I think, is important, as well as taking baby steps. I mean, once we were really aware of this issue, I'm impatient with it. I really want to get to the next steps right away. And having the initial conversations and laying the groundwork and sharing the data and then letting people, as Larry said, solve problems themselves takes time. The problem didn't occur overnight, so it isn't going to be solved overnight, but having to slow down the pace is something that I have to constantly remind myself.
Okay, great. Thank you, everyone. Wonderful work. Heather, please take it away.
Okay, so I want to thank our wonderful panelists, too, and I would also like to thank all of you, our participants, for your engagement throughout the session. We noticed some of the questions that you were asking in the parking lot. We've taken note of them, and we'd like to take this time to have the panel respond to those questions. And the first one comes from Tina Gregory, who I think may be a district leader of another sort, but not a superintendent. And she's asking, what suggestions can you offer to get superintendent buy-in to address this issue when it's a documented concern?
Hi, it's Victor Valeski from East Brunswick. So no one else is going to buy in unless the superintendent does. The superintendent, as leader of the organization, has to set the tone and the standard. And it has to be a personal conviction that this is something that it exists. We have to acknowledge it exists, and you have to figure out to what degree it exists in your organization. But I would venture to say that every single organization is dealing with some issue of disproportionality.
I think
Does
it
anyone
helps.
else want to comment on that? Go ahead.
Yeah, I think this is Larry Spring at Schenectady. I think it helps to bring, enacted values or values in action to the surface and begin to, let's take a look at what it is that we say that we value and what it is that we think or what it is that our actions show that we value. When we can identify those gaps, I think it begins to get people to think more deeply about where it is that they really want to be and how those actions might begin to change. It's an odd question. It's always difficult to supervise upwards, but there's certainly some element of I think influence to be had there.
Hi, this is Clarence. One of the things that we did in our district was last November. In fact, Larry Spring and we presented at a conference in Minnesota, and when I returned, my immediate supervisor, my senior superintendent, said, "Oh, what are you going to need for your presentation?" I said, "What?" She said, "Oh, yeah, you're presenting for all of the other 45 superintendents." And one of the things I was able to do was gather data for each of their districts. So the interesting thing is that in this educational world that we live in, people kind of are myopic. They have their blinders on. They're only interested in what's going on in their building. No fault of their own, but it's just the business at hand to, student achievement, standardized scores, handling teacher evaluations, et cetera. And before you know, when they look up, this data is right in their face. So oftentimes what I found in my district when I brought it back to District 17 was many of the principals were not even aware that these numbers, this data that adds to, stereotypes for children of color, let's say, was just piling up under their nose unbeknownst to them. So I think the important thing is to, again, have the data in front of them, and what will happen is they'll recognize it. They'll see student names that are attached to the suspensions, teachers that are suspending a certain number of students, more than others, and that's a way of providing differentiated support. We always talk about providing differentiated instruction for students, so this way the superintendent can provide differentiated support to different school buildings and principals and their staff. So I think that's the way to go, to have the data in front of them and have them really take a deep dive and deep look at it.
I would also ask, I would almost approach it in the same way that we're approaching it with teachers. This is a problem, but we're going to break it down into smaller steps. So maybe we're not going to look at, it depends on your individual building's needs, but we're not going to look at a K-8 G&T program. Let's just look at this small population of students in grades 4 and 5, and maybe we'll just do one pilot this year, or we're going to look at the reading materials in certain grade levels. Rather than say, okay, this is a big issue, let's just break it down into a couple of baby steps, some smaller challenges. And once the superintendent starts to see that maybe the performance of kids in a particular demographic group is improving, they might be more likely to look at the whole issue district-wide.
This is Victor Valeski again. I just want to leave one thought for the audience. So I'm an A-type personality, so if you give me a problem, I want to come up with a solution, and then let's move on to the next problem. In this process, I think that every time we address an issue, we come up with more questions than we have solutions. And so that's been a process for us in determining, yeah, these are things we haven't looked at before. These are things we need to investigate. And how do we align our district resources in an effective way? And when I say resources, I'm talking about financial and our human resources in an effective way to actually make gains on some of these issues, knowing this is a long-term process. This is not a one-year fix.
Right. So the next question comes from Brad Boxley, Anna Kushner, and there's also Tiamosa Martin. We consolidated these. They want to know, what specific methods have you used to help teachers and leaders uncover and manage personal bias and professional preferences that are barriers to equitable classroom practices?
Hi, this is Joyce Foley. As I mentioned earlier, my staff and I have been engaging around the work of Carol Dweck at Stanford University. Her book, The Growth Mindset, is a valuable resource, and her program, which is an online, interactive online program called Brainology for students, has been very well received by our student population as well.
So data is a really powerful thing, so when you can demonstrate, what's happening as outcome, that will often create some good reflection for folks. But there's also, a nice online tool that we've had folks use out of Harvard that can detect implicit bias that people have, and almost everyone has some. And when you approach it in that way, that we all have bias, it's a matter of being aware of it so that we can think about how it shapes our actions, and we can then mitigate that. We ask people to take that and then ask them to engage in some notion of reflection with it, and some of our buildings have done that, and we've had a lot of folks find that that's a powerful experience. The results are not shared with anyone. They're the only ones that ever, each person is the only one who ever sees their results. But it gets more people involved in the conversation. It gets more people open to the notion that their biases really exist, and it does in some way shape their actions that they need to be more aware of.
And just a follow-up, if that online tool is available, if you could just post that for us, for our participants, that would be great. Does anyone else want to respond to that question about managing biases and personal preferences before we move on to the next question?
Teresa, in Piscataway, I think there's been some great materials that Patrick has showed districts in the training, and the questionnaires about white privilege, some of the videos that people can just look at and see inherent biases. I think there's there are a number of, as Larry said, number of online tools to look at in terms of where do my biases fit in. I think each of those has been helpful in just kind of getting the conversation started among teachers as well as our leadership.
Right, and thanks for bringing that up, Teresa. I do want to remind people that this is one of 4 webinars in the Disproportionality series. All of them are available as recordings, and you can get those at our REL MidAtlantic website. So I just want to make sure that you know that is also a resource for you to learn about the work of uncovering biases and professional preferences. And so our next question comes from Kim Riley, who wants to know, how does decreasing disproportionality district-wide help a district meet requirements under the Every Student Succeed Act?
Well, I do know that this is Clarence from District 17. I know that the year before I arrived in our district, we had a extremely high number of incidents. The first year that I entered the district, we had between September and April, and the reason I'm cutting it off at April is because we're in April right now. We had 1,785 high-level incidents, and correspondingly, that resulted in 825 either teacher removal, principal suspensions, or superintendent suspensions. And this year, for the same time period, we almost had the same amount of incidents. We had a 3% reduction in the incidents, but our suspensions and removals were reduced by 49%. We went from 825 down to 411, and what that did was improve our attendance drastically for children that normally would be in a suspension site. And oftentimes parents wouldn't, when their children were suspended, would not send them to the suspension site. And what that would impact was their on task time on task, and as a result, we had the second highest gain in the city in both literacy and math performance on grades 3 through 8 state exams, and a large number of those increases were our students of color who had previously had a high level of recidivism for suspension. So they're going to be in class. The students are going to be present and accounted for, and it aligns to all the research on attendance as it relates to academic performance. So, I mean, for District 17, it was amazing.
All right. Does anyone else want to respond to that before we move on to the next question from Renee Edgehill? Renee Edgehill wants to know about alternatives to suspension. So her question is, what resources are available to provide alternatives instead of suspending students?
This is Victor Valeski from East Brunswick. So we've been looking at this. One of the challenges this year was for us to really try to get in front of this issue early with our students. So Joyce Foley has been working with me to develop an induction program for our newest students into East Brunswick. So as they move in as elementary students, then hopefully we're able to indoctrinate them and get ahead of this issue. We don't have to worry about later on in their educational career the issue of suspension. For those students who come in later, we're finding that some of our students are moving into our district at the high school level. Maybe they've been involved in multiple family moves. They've left their friends. There's some frustration on their part. They're not going to perform at the level that we think they should be at in our district. They act out, results in a long-term suspension. We're currently looking at a school within a school model and creating an opportunity, rather than having them suspended long-term, to have an alternative program that runs in the evening so they could actually acquire the credits to graduation in an alternative setting, with an opportunity to be reindoctrinated into the normal population, the regular population, if they demonstrate compliance with the rules and the regulations that we set forth. But that is something that's still in development.
So in Schenectady, we're looking at alternatives to suspension, not as kind of one rote program, but looking at things much more on a diagnostic and prescriptive basis. So most kids who engage in conduct that would require long-term suspension have some notion of a behavioral health issue, and so we engage in some level of diagnostic analysis to figure out, what we think that issue is. And we're building our list of what are the evidence-based treatments that have proven to be more effective at treating that issue than suspension. Now, suspension is, generally a really, really bad treatment for those issues, so it's not very hard to beat that as a standard. but we use a more scientific standard around whether or not the evidence says it's effective. And so, for example, for kids who engage in violent incidents, how their testing comes out, they may need something very mild, engage in some restorative practices. They may have a more significant mental health issue, and they may need something like aggression replacement therapy, which is several weeks of group therapy in a structured way until they're safe and ready to come back to school. It may be a family dynamic, and they may need a notion, some iteration of family therapy that's prescribed. And so with the mental health agency in the county, with juvenile justice, with the police department, we've agreed on a set of acts. A kid does this. Here's the process that they're going to go through, and here are the agreed upon treatments that we will prescribe, rather than long-term suspension or putting them into the system, into the juvenile justice system, and instead they'll get one of these treatments. And we're going through with each of our behavioral areas, and we're identifying as a team what are the evidence-based treatments that we think make sense for our community for these types of acts.
Great. And so thanks so much. And I just want to move on to the next question that's coming from Anna Krishner and Tiamosa Martin around getting everyone on the same page. They want to know, how are districts developing their central teams to ensure consistency and alignment in expectations and support?
Hi, this is Clarence. When I got to the district, what I did was to make sure that the principals knew I took this work very seriously, and that there was a lot of honor and respect behind it. I assigned one of my principals as one of the coordinators of this work around TAC-D and our Guardians of Equity team. That provided a consistency. This was someone that was an experienced educator, and at first I'm sure she believed it was just another program. But then when she saw the consistency of follow-up, the infusion of resources, and how I valued her check-ins with me and how she kept me up to date on what was going on in schools when they were developing their 5-year plans. I think that was also something that was advantageous. Again, as one of my colleagues mentioned earlier, this isn't about a quick fix. This is something that took many years to reach this point of something that was continuous, ongoing, and causing dysfunction. So by having a set district coordinator, which we were able to afford to provide, gave it that level of credibility and gravitas and seriousness as well, that they knew this is something that was very, very important. In fact, our entire city, after I presented to our citywide superintendents, our chancellor stated that each district, each of our 32 community districts and 10 high school districts would pick one school that they felt would benefit from this work with TAC-D and disproportionality, and they were to embark on this road towards a culturally responsive education. So it became so effective that the whole city is behind it now, and it could be very, very fruitful in the long run.
This is Teresa in Piscataway, and I think the point that Joyce made earlier about everybody doing common readings and having book clubs was really, that was our leadership team's introduction. But as we tackled some of these issues, we put together committees of principals that were interested in specific topics. It was definitely a bottom-up rather than a top-down issue with it. For example, as we examined the code of conduct and what's the follow-up for behaviors, a committee of principals worked with the behaviorists in the district, who really outlined, here are the steps we're all going to go through before we get to suspensions and some of the more serious consequences like referral to our mental health clinics. We've really started having our principals who are doing some of this work presenting this at the leadership team meetings. One of our principals is very comfortable having meetings with subgroups of parents. He talked about that and what were some of the challenges in bringing all of the parents of one particular population together. Alex has presented at the, to kind of talk about what he's looking at in terms of academic disproportionality. So I think that involving principals and getting them excited to see what some of their colleagues are doing is a good way to cement the central team, the core team, and then bring it back to the individual schools.
Great, and I think we're going to have Teresa from Piscataway have the last word on that. Thank you so much. I do want to point out one last question that came through from Sharon Wells, who wanted to ask about concrete examples and resources that you've used to shift the hearts and minds of folks in the districts. And so Dr. Patrick Jean-Pierre has offered to send out some resources, so we'll make sure that we get those to our participants. It is 1:30, and we're going to be closing out now. So I just want to once again thank all of our session participants and thank our amazing panel and our moderator. I want to thank our partners at the New Jersey Department of Education and the NYU Technical Assistance Center on Disproportionality. And as always, we want to know if today's session met your needs. So we'd like any suggestions that you might have so that we can better serve you in the future. So please provide us with your feedback. You're being prompted to do so now. Again, I want to extend everyone a great day, a wonderful weekend, and we hope you'll join us for future REL webinars and events. Thank you, everyone.